if you know you need to do certain things to take care of yourself, from a self-care perspective, everybody has to focus on that. That's not just a conversation that happens around those that are in recovery or those that are struggling, or this is a human issue. We don't do enough to take care of ourselves. We don't prioritize ourselves enough, and yet we expect to show up and do what we need to do on a daily basis.
That was my guest this week, Allison Walsh. Welcome to the Recover Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Martin John, the Recovery Mentor. Here we are always looking at the topics you'll face while on a journey to recovering yourself. This podcast is all about expanding the reach and definitions and scope of how we understand both addiction and recovery. I'm interested in doing this so everyone has an opportunity to recover themselves. And just like Allison mentioned a moment ago, this is a human issue. And no matter where you are on your journey, there is a place for you here. Alongside being a recovery advocate, speaker, author, and founder and president of her own nonprofit, Allison is the VP of Business Development and Branding for Advanced Recovery Systems. She's been doing this work for a while and has arrived here due to her own battles with an eating disorder. Today, Allison and I are talking all about the struggle. Not the struggle to get out of the hole of addiction, but the struggle to keep climbing. We cover a lot in our conversation, but one of the key takeaways is that no matter what we're attempting to do, we'll probably never have the perfect route to success. There will always be something we can look to and use it to not take action today. So we can use the excuses that are present, or we can just start where we are. The pandemic inspired some people to take action while many others spun out of control. There's no telling what it will take to get someone to take that first step. But that first step, albeit the hardest, is the one that you can take at any moment. So why not take it now? Allison, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited because you started your treatment center, yes? I mean, do I want to call it a treatment center? Is that right?
Yeah. So, I've had a beautiful journey in behavioral health. It actually started almost 20 years ago, which is crazy. I started a nonprofit for eating disorders, and I ran that for 18 years. During that time, I was also invited to join Advanced Recovery Systems. I was actually one of the first people to start there 8 years ago. So I've been involved since the very beginning, which has been just such an incredible honor to be able to see an organization go from concept to where we are now, getting closer and closer to that 1,000 employee mark, and just expanding across the country, being able to really change a lot of lives. And so, been able to be on the nonprofit side, the for-profit side, but at the end of the day, it's all about helping people. And it's just been a beautiful journey.
Yeah. And that's such a big part of like all of our work, all of us that are in recovery. And I know you've dealt with eating disorder things. And so we are here to talk primarily today about having to take action, because it's never an ideal time. But right. During the pandemic, it seemed like it was extremely not an ideal time. Mm-hmm. And can you talk to me a little bit about the difference between that idea of, well, I will change when, and what it really means to, own your life?
Right. Well, this is just such a great question and lead into just so many wonderful things that we can talk about on this end. But you know how hard it is to make that first call, right? To finally admit that you need help, you need support, your life is unmanageable, you don't want to continue going down this path, and yet you don't necessarily know what to do next or how you're going to get out of the hole that you feel like you're in. And so that's the normal situation. Then you add in the fact that we're all dealing with something that no one has ever dealt with in our generation, right? You have a pandemic going on. It's, exacerbated by financial stress, by emotional stress, by everything you could possibly think of. And yet the way that we have to move through this is in isolation, and it's by ourselves, and it's socially distanced from those that you love and that support you. So if you're struggling, right, like it made it even worse. And because the last thing you need to do is just continue to pull back. You need to be around people that can help you, that love you, that can support you. So we found, a lot during this time, especially in the very beginning, there was this big resistance to wanting to get help. A lot of people were afraid of going and seeking services. A lot of places shut down, right? A lot of Providers weren't seeing people face to face, and telehealth wasn't necessarily set up the way that it needed to be yet. So there was a pocket, especially early in the beginning, for a lot of people that their situation got worse quicker than what we had normally seen. But going back to that, it's never a good time, right? It never feels like a good time when you're in the depths of whatever you're struggling with, whether it's addiction, whether it's eating disorders, whether it's mental health. It never feels like the right time. It just feels like I don't have any other choice at this point, and I've got to do something. And so that's very much the same, right? And I think now people are realizing, like, I can't live like this. And so many people that are experiencing symptoms or are coping in a different way than what they were before are realizing, like, I shouldn't, and I don't want to continue down this path. So we're starting to see a lot more people be more proactive, which is a good thing. But it's a scary situation that we're in right now.
And it should be said that in a pandemic, maybe it's not an ideal time, but once the pandemic is over, it's not an ideal time, because then all of a sudden, like, you are around, like, you can find an excuse in this anywhere. It can always not be a good time. So in speaking about that, what are some of the common inner dialogues that you've experienced that when you're living under the influence of something begins to dictate how you interact with the world, and how you have to, like, double down on maybe bad decisions?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I've heard every reason in the book at this point, right? So I've been doing this for a long time. And, people go through various stages of willingness, right? And so you get it when they're really, okay, I'm ready to change my life. And then the longer it goes from that first call to when somebody actually gets in to seek services, there can be a lot of excuses or reasons why they don't want to go or they're afraid to go. And a lot of that, right, comes from fear. Whatever they're using or however they're coping has become a major part of their way of life. And that can be very scary to not know, how will I deal with life, right? Especially when your social circle copes and deals and manages the same way. It might mean you have to change a lot of big things in your life, people, places, and things, right? We talk about triggers all of the time. And for a lot of people, the more successful their recovery is going to be based on their situation, right? Like with their surrounding, their environment. And so it might mean some big life changes, which can, again, spark fear. But I will say that I've never heard anybody say they've regretted to try. Right. And I think that's the thing that I want to really stress, is that it might seem scary and it might bring up a lot of emotions, and you might not know how you're going to get through it right now, but trust that there's an amazing professional community out there that wants to support you, right? The recovery community is a beautiful place. There are so many wonderful support groups and services and communities across this country that are literally waiting for you to pick up the phone and call them. And I think when you think about it like that, it changes things a little bit.
Yeah, and that's expanding in so many new ways today. The veil between us and our future, let's say, it seems thinner than it's ever been. Like, I kind of feel like in the 50s, the future was this brick wall of what will it be? And I feel like substance was a way to thin that brick wall. I think now we do have access more to, like, this open sort of spirit approach of, like, oh wow, I can feel lighter. And in that, like, you've dealt with eating disorder. And you worked with people with eating disorders. Now, because the traditional idea of recovery, which is abstinence, is not available, this is not an ideal way of addressing it. But So how does one address things that, okay, I have to do this every day, and yet I have to stop doing this in this way, in this manner every day?
Yeah. No, it was quite the recovery journey, right? So I had such a terrible relationship with food by the time it all kind of hit the ceiling, that it took a long time for me to get to the point where I am now, even where I was 5-10 years ago. And you're absolutely right. There's a lot of struggles when it comes to those that are trying to rebuild that relationship with their bodies and with food. And foods can be triggers, right? So and you have to eat, right? Like, unless you're going to be on a feeding tube for the rest of your life, you have got to start to make those moves. And so for me, right, like working with my dietitian, working with my team, it was a gradual reintegration of foods into my diet that, number one, I needed to have, that I had cut out for, like, you talk about excuses and reasons. I had every reason in the book to not eat certain things, right? Like, it was ridiculous when I look back at it now, and so it was a challenge. But I also, once I got to a point where I was able to gradually do it and move through it, I began to be very proud of myself in the process, right? So, it was a big deal when I started eating meat again. It was a big deal when I could go out to dinner with my friends again. It was a big deal, right? So you start to celebrate those big deals and realize how much better life is having a healthier relationship, but also with food, but also with yourself. And, for me, my eating disorder wasn't about size or shape, right? It wasn't about losing weight. It wasn't about any of that. It was really about control. And it was about, this was how I was reacting and responding to situations that I had faced in my life up until that point. And so getting on solid ground there, right? And knowing, how am I going to deal and cope with life and stress and everything moving forward, and not resort to my eating disorder as a way to numb, as a way to handle what I was going through, was a really big part of the journey. But yeah, you're right. Food was my control, and you have to eat. So right. It was something I had to work through, and it was a gradual, long process, but it was so worth it.
Absolutely. And I love that you talk about it as a gradual thing. So many people get into recovery and just want to be recovered. I'm good. Like, no, I'm good. And so in your work with advanced recovery systems, how have you seen the embracing of the gradual?
Well, I mean, you hit it on the head, right? Like, people want to flip the switch and think that, I made this decision, which is a huge decision, right? Like, I don't want to undervalue how difficult it is to say, okay, I'm ready to change my life. Like, that's a big step, and one that, again, should be celebrated. But it's critically important that you realize that you've got to do the work, right? And it's going to bring things up, and you're going to realize things about yourself that you didn't realize. And recovery can be very messy, and that's okay, right? Like, it's better to bare your soul and to get it all out there and to figure out why the heck you've gone down this path, right? Like, what caused it? Because if you can get really honest with yourself and you can figure out what the root of this stuff is, right? And why you've turned to whatever it is, eating disorders, drugs, alcohol, why you're in this situation that you're in, you're going to be able to figure out what you need to do for yourself in the future so that you don't turn to those things, right? And like, that's a big piece of it. And, for me, I didn't figure it out in the first year I was in recovery, right? It took years, and that was okay, right? Because I was committed to changing my life. I always looked at it as, every time I talked about it, or I told my story, or I worked on myself or with my therapist or whatever it was like I was putting a puzzle back together again. And it was like one puzzle piece at a time. And all of a sudden, certain things that I didn't even realize made sense. And I'll tell you, there's stuff that I'm still figuring out now, yes. And I am 18 years on the other side of this. Yeah. And I think that, you've got to do it for yourself, because like I mentioned already, there's going to be things that come up in life. Life is messy, right? There's stress. Like, look what we're living through right now. You have to know what to do, what your triggers are, and how you respond, not how everybody else responds, how you respond, and what you need to do as a result of that.
For me, in 20 years, still learning about where I want to escape. And I'm still escaping. I still have things in my life in which help me escape. And yet, I still want to get rid of those ultimately. That doesn't mean I have to judge myself, but like you said, I mean, you didn't use this word, but I use this word, get curious instead of furious, right? Like let's just get curious about why am I escaping? Why do I want to do this thing that I know in 10 minutes when I'm done doing it, I'm not going to like that I have done?
Yeah, no, and that's very common too. We talk about like riding the wave, right? Like when you're going through something, you get triggered, you want to escape, you want to numb, you want to run away. Usually it takes about 15 minutes to get over that hurdle. And so like one of the things is having a go-to activity or person or thing that is healthy and safe and not going to lead you down a path that you don't want to go down. And so, that's very common though, and again, it's like life, right? And you deal with different levels of stress in different periods of time. And, I think it's, again, knowing who to call, where to turn, what to do, because it is a process, right? Like just because you finish treatment or you finish intensive outpatient therapy or whatever you're doing, right? Like that doesn't mean it's over, right? It just means that your ongoing support might look a little bit different than what it did when it was at its most intense level, right? And so making sure that you always have those people in your life that you can turn to, making sure that you have therapeutic resources, doctors, whoever you need to have on your team. You need to make sure that they're always there. Even if you're not utilizing them, you need to know what to do when you do need them, right? And like, that's the other thing too. I always get nervous when I hear from folks that I've either helped along their journey or I've, helped them, navigate the process, the system, all of this, right? And I say, how are you doing? They say, great. I'm like, are you still seeing your therapist? No, not really checking in, not doing any of that stuff. I'm like, okay, well, what are you doing to take care of your recovery and you?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's your outlet? What are you doing right now? Right? Because you'll be at different phases of recovery for your whole life. Like I do believe in full recovery. I do think it's possible. And, but it doesn't mean that you're not working on yourself, right? It doesn't mean like everything stops. It means that you're at a different phase and this is like maintenance, right? This is how you're taking care of yourself for the long haul. And these are the things that you do to preserve your recovery. So I think it's really important that you always know who those people are, what those resources are, where to turn, what to do, and how to ride that wave.
And that's why so much of what I do is talk about what is it we're recovering towards. Because like recovering from, that is a stage. And like you said, I also believe in full recovery of that. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily know that we can totally recover ourselves, like our God beings or whatever, however we want to look at it. But at least not in this time, in this timeline currently, I don't kind of feel like that's possible. I mean, Jesus got real close. I think the Buddha got real close, things like that, and that is ultimately what we can achieve. And so, I look at as we wind up from the pandemic, we have individuals who probably don't recognize with traditional addiction, and yet they have some major, what I would consider pacifiers that help them escape. Some of those could be drugs and alcohol. Some of those could be eating. I mean, I've been hearing a lot about like people who have gained weight, like in the news and other things like that over this. Like, how can people who don't identify with traditional addiction and with the definition of addiction probably, like admit that they still have some recovery to incorporate into their lives?
I think one of the best things that you can do right now is think about what your life was a year ago and have any of those patterns changed. Are you drinking more? Are you sleeping less? Are you more anxious? Are you feeling depressed? Like, do a checkup from the neck up, right? You can use screening tools to evaluate where you are currently and be honest with yourself, right? Yeah. Like if you're having another glass of wine every night on top of what you normally had before, might want to try to cut back. If you have a hard time cutting back to what you were doing before, might be headed in the wrong direction, right? It doesn't need to be severe for it to be a problem, right? Like that's another piece of this is that, change and addiction and dependence and all of this stuff can take a while to really show, the severity of it. And I think the most important thing is if what you're doing right now isn't in alignment with what you want to be or where you want to go, you need to make the changes before it becomes a real issue. right? Like the earlier you can address the fact that you don't like that you're drinking too much, you don't like that you feel this way, you don't like that you're not sleeping well, you don't like that your fuse is shorter than what it used to be, then fix it now. Like, why are we waiting, right? Like, and I think that what I like about this time is that I feel for the very first time, people are really opening up and saying, I'm not okay right now, right? Like, and it's okay to not be okay, but it's not okay to not be okay and not do anything about it, right? Like, that's the piece of it that I still feel like everybody needs to say, because I'm hearing it. I hear it in song lyrics. I hear it on the news. I hear all this stuff, but then what? So fix it. And I think that's the piece. It doesn't have to be a severe issue, right? It could be like, I just don't like the fact that I've increased my use, or I've increased this, or I'm feeling this way. Like, do it now before it becomes a much bigger issue.
And this relates right back to our topic, which is the ideal, right? Like I always like expanding definitions of things, right? Like, so when we talk about ideal, we often look at, well, it's not the best time. But the thing is in our minds, what addiction means has an ideal. There is the rock bottom. And many people like to tell themselves, well, I'm not there, so I don't have to do anything about it. I don't look like this. Like for myself, it was like, oh, I didn't drink bottom shelf vodka, so I don't have a problem. Yeah. I had a big problem, right? Like, so once that thought, because that thought is in our minds about, it's probably in everybody's mind about something. Like, I just don't like that I do this, but I can consistently or constantly continue to do it. Asking the question and being curious about like why I continue doing it is huge. And my big stumbling block in talking about it is like, how do I get somebody to just add awareness? And one of the things I talk about is awareness avoidance. We love awareness avoidance, and we'll pick up any pacifier to help us avoid being aware. But how do we get someone to stop avoiding being aware?
Well, I mean, we can talk ourselves out of doing anything that we don't really want to do, right? And I think that's really important to give itself its own space to think about, right? Like, you go from this period of like, I know I need to make a change, to contemplating to make a change. And then all of a sudden it's like, but I don't really want to make a change because that means I'm going to have to do work. And I don't want to do work because I'm tired and I'm stressed and anxious. I got all this stuff, right? Like, so it's just this hamster wheel that we allow ourselves to stay on. And that's in everything, right? Like, that's not just in what we're talking about. That's in just like life, right? So I think it's making that commitment to yourself to say, I don't want to do life like this, right? Like, I want to do life like that. And having that, whatever you're striving for, be a motivator for you, right? Like, whatever it is that you want and your why, when you have a really strong why, it helps so much. And you know, I really encourage people that are listening to think about that. What is your why? Why do you get up and do what you do every day? Why are you striving for whatever you're striving? What makes you tick, right? And then why are you continuing to put yourself in a position where, you know, you're using, abusing, or just not taking care of yourself, right? Like, what's there? Why aren't you prioritizing you? You want all these other things and you have your why, but why aren't you prioritizing you? Because if you're not here to do those things and to live that life that you say you want, then what are we doing, right? Like, you have to get back to the core of, you got to take care of yourself. You have one life, right? That's the most important thing. We have one chance on this earth. And for many of us, we feel like we've been given a second, third, fourth, fifth chance, depending on the hell that we've been through, our own journeys. And, you know, when you don't have to get to that point to appreciate life and to make change and to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. And avoiding the reality of your situation isn't going to get you where you need to go. It's only going to dig you deeper into the hole that you're in. And so that's the biggest thing now, is like, you see a sign, you see a symptom, you realize you're not feeling the way that you should, fix it, right? Like, talk to somebody, make a phone call. Like, I think that's the other thing during this time. So many resources are available, right? Like this world, and I'm sure you can attest to this. You got clean and sober 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I started my journey 18, 19 years ago in recovery. Like, it was a different world back then. There were not nearly as many resources or support. The system was very difficult to navigate. Insurance was a nightmare. Like, it was a totally different landscape. And yet there's millions of us, millions, right, that can say that they got through it, they got well, and they're living their lives now, right? And I think that's the piece, is like, if so many people have come before us and so many people have walked in our shoes and know what it feels like to be struggling or just not happy with where they are in their life right now, there are millions of examples of people that have made it through and that are living awesome lives and that have started over, have healed themselves. And it's a journey. You've already mentioned it. I agree with you 1,000%. The whole point of being alive is to evolve into the complete person you were intended to be. It does not happen overnight. It's not a quick fix. It's a journey. And I think if you look at it like that, like, I'm going to wake up every day and I'm going to try to be 1% better today than I was yesterday. That is totally doable. But I have to commit to the fact that I need to pay attention to what's happening inside. If I'm not feeling good upstairs, I need to do the work. Right? If I'm feeling more stressed, I need to do the work. I need to recognize the signs and symptoms. I need to take the screening tools. I need to use what's at my disposal, and then I need to act on it. And the only person that can act on it is me, and I think that's the piece. It's extreme ownership over our own selves. And it's critically important to do it earlier, when you still have the cognitive ability to make the change yourself. Because if you keep going and that hole just keeps getting dug deeper and it just is getting darker and darker down that hole, other people are going to have to step in and intervene. And you don't want to get to that point, right? Like, that's what you want to avoid.
Right. I did a interview not long ago with Jeffrey Godfrey, and we talked about the idea of admitting you have a problem before everyone else knows it. Like, because it's like, what you knew, and you get so angry when someone else points it out because you know. One of the things I wanted to mention that we're talking really kind of closely about is so I had a history in the arts, and as a painter, I remember I would have a painting, and it wouldn't work. It wouldn't be working. It wouldn't be working for a while, and then I would hone in on the one part that I liked, and I would get rid of that. Like, just because it's like, that's the thing that is probably making all of this just messy. Because I have this, I identify with that one little part really closely. And the reason that's coming up, and it would always kind of render itself like, oh, now I can get through, like, that was the thing that blocked me. This is in what we're talking about, so much of, I think, so much of our ability to avoid being aware is because we like a thing in our life and we don't want to lose that thing. And so we continue, whether it's a relationship that is, transactional, that revolves around our addiction, or whether it's, something with us. There's a thing that we like and we're afraid to lose that. And I'm going to tell everybody right now, you're probably going to lose that, but you're going to lose it to something so much better. Like, you are moving towards yourself. Every step you take, every choice you make that is like, I don't like this, and then you deal with that in however you need to deal with that, you are going to start a journey. That first step is probably the biggest and hardest step, but it doesn't necessarily get easier as you kind of move forward. It just becomes your life and your why, like you mentioned, your why becomes you.
No, I completely agree with everything you just said, right? It's difficult to see when you're in the trenches, right? Because all of these things that we don't want to lose are like our security blankets, right? They're the safety, they're the coping mechanism, it's your social circle, it's whatever it is, right? It's the glitz and glamour of the life that you've created, and it's built on heavy social drinking and partying. Like, I mean, there's so many, there's a million examples here of what it could be. And it's that fear of like, what's life going to be like without it? And that's scary, right? And that's where you have to trust your support network. You have to trust the people that are going to help guide you through the journey. You have to trust yourself to know that you've survived 100% of your days up until now, and you'll get through this too. And it's really, really important that you continue to think about what could it be like, right, on the other side. How beautiful could life be?
With you having so much time, and what were some things that you had to face this year that related to your own fears and the things that you had to walk through?
Oh my gosh. I mean, this year was insane, right? So for all of us, we had March happened. I oversee a national community outreach team, right? So I've got 35, 40 people on my team who are just amazing, compassionate, incredible humans, many of who are also in recovery or are connected to somebody who is. And all of us, our whole lives were flipped upside down. My team is not used to working on the inside. We're used to being out in the community. We're used to working with healthcare providers. We're used to being able to walk into a hospital and sit down next to somebody and say, let me help you today, right? And being able to do our work. So there was my concern over all of my people, right? I knew how I was feeling. I know that nobody wanted to be inside with all of this uncertainty. Then you add in financial stress, right? It's like we built this amazing company for 8 years. I've poured my soul into it. And all of a sudden we had to stop admissions into all of our centers. Well, we kind of got our bearings and figured out what are we going to do? How are we going to keep everybody safe? And so that was scary, right? Like trying to figure out how to do the next right thing with no guidebook, right? Feeling so out of control of everything. And for somebody, I talked about my eating disorder is all about control. So for me, not being in control is the worst thing ever in my, for me. And so having to be okay with trusting myself, trusting my team, taking it literally one day at a time, sometimes hours at a time, because things were happening so quickly. And it was one of those situations where I was either going to rise or I was going to crumble. There really wasn't going to be a middle, right? Because there were so many pivotal, huge things that we had to do and act on, that if I would have let the stress of all of it get in my way, I wouldn't have been able to make sound decisions, and I wouldn't have been able to lead the team through all of this. Add in the fact that I had one of my close relatives had their own health challenges, all during this time, early on too, couldn't go see him in the hospital, couldn't do, it was just all of this stuff. So it just kept building and building and building and building. And then, we're left going, okay, now what? Right. But again, it was one day at a time, one decision at a time, one adjustment at a time, one sacrifice at a time, right? We had to make decisions. We made sacrifices for our team to continue to be able to do what they did, right? And that was what we needed to do, and it was what was right in the moment, right? And I know looking back, there's a few things that I would have done differently, but overall, I'm really proud of the fact that I was in a healthy place to be able to lead through this pandemic. Because if I wouldn't have been taking care of myself, if I wasn't sticking to my daily routine, if I wasn't doing the things that I know I have to do for myself to keep myself in a really good place, it wouldn't have been the same outcome, right? And those are the things that I think I could have easily let go of that morning routine. For me, mornings are everything, right? I get up super early. It's the time that I have to myself. I pour into my own cup so that I can pour into others all day long, right? I have to do that for myself. It makes me a better team member, makes me a better wife, makes me a better mom, makes me a better person. I'm happier, right? And so I could have easily said, I'm not going to do it. I'm home. The kids are here, homeschool, this, that. I could have made a million excuses.
Right.
But instead of saying, I'm not going to do it, I said, I'm going to get up a little bit earlier because now my kids are getting up earlier. We're all home. What is going on, right? Yeah. But preserving that time to take care of myself made a massive difference. And so, you can't compromise on yourself. You can't shortchange what you need. And especially going through times like this, if you know you need to do certain things to take care of yourself from a self-care perspective, everybody has to focus on that. That's not just a conversation that happens around those that are in recovery or those that are struggling, or this is a human issue. Right. We don't do enough to take care of ourselves. We don't prioritize ourselves enough. And yet we expect to show up and do what we need to do on a daily basis. And so that was something that I absolutely 100% attribute to being able to get through this, but also knowing when I needed to take a day and, just disconnect and have some time with my family and not feel like the world was going to implode, because it was already imploding, right? Whether I took a mental health day or not, the world was going to keep turning and everything is going to be okay. But knowing when to say, I need a day, or I need a couple days, or I need to take a half day on a couple of Fridays just so that I can chill out, because the level of stress is intense when you're trying to work through this. But everybody was dealing with higher levels of stress. So
we're going through something, like all together. We can't put our finger on it and all this. I mean, we can see it, but it's a big deal. You actually answered very well my next question, but I do want to ask it because it might kind of spark something else. How has all of these challenges that have come at ill times, right? Like you have just been forced to deal with it. How has that allowed you, or how has that taught you how to better love yourself?
I think every single day that I woke up and I didn't feel sick, or I wasn't experiencing symptoms, or for goodness sakes, I was just breathing, I was so grateful. So I found myself leaning on gratitude a lot more and realizing that I'm blessed, I'm alive, I've got gifts and talents that are allowing me to do what I do on a daily basis. I've got a lot of people that are depending on me, and I'm capable of doing this, but I've got to take care of me, right, to be able to do it. And so it's impossible to fully show up for others if you're not showing up for yourself. And I had to get really focused on doing what I needed to do to take care of me, to get enough sleep, to fill up my cup, right, to find joy in a really dark time for all of us. And say, you know what, we're going to do this. We're going to get through this together. And I'm here to support you. And I know they'll be here to support me. Right. And so just having those conversations and being really honest, not only at work, but at home, with friends. I mean, it wasn't just about self-love. It was about more love for everybody. But I think my level of gratitude and appreciation was like on steroids this past year, even as like crappy as so many things were, and not so many things that I could look back and be like, God, that year was terrible, right? But I also look at it and say, this was the year that woke us all up, right? This was the year that showed us like how much we were taking for granted, and truly how much time was just flying by that we were allowing to just be depleted from our existence. And now it's like, I'm home, I'm with my kids, right? Like I traveled a lot before. I haven't flown for a year, and I've gotten to experience a lot of beautiful moments. And I'm hoping that post-pandemic, a lot of that continues, right? That I have a new way of handling life and new expectations for myself. And most importantly, a ton of self-respect and gratitude for where I'm at this point in my journey.
In order to love others in that unconditional way that we would really like to, I think we really have to love ourselves in that same way. So, Allison, thank you so much. I really appreciate you spending some time with me and throwing out all this wisdom, because it was really wonderful to get down and chat with you about all of this.
Oh, thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so, and thank you for all you're doing and how you're continuing to have really important conversations in a time where it's more important than ever. So thank you for what you do.
Well, thank you. Gratitude cannot be something we overlook, but the only way we can master gratitude, especially if it feels like something that's foreign to us, is to practice. When I speak with clients, I always encourage pretending when they're adamant they can't do something. So if you find it difficult to feel grateful, try to pretend to be grateful for something. Pretending may not be a direct route to actually achieving something like deep gratitude, but it's a step in the right direction. Of course, I hope none of you are struggling so much that you have to pretend to be grateful for something. But if you're honest with yourself and you find that is the case, well, relieve yourself of the burden of trying to be grateful. and just pretend to be. You can find links to everything Allison is doing in the description of this episode. Please rate and review this podcast and/or leave comments for this episode to help me better create helpful content. Support this show at anchor.fm or support me and my work at Patreon, where you can get access to unedited content as well as to supporter group portrait sessions with me. I host workshops regularly, which are both open to the public and are a source of continuing education units for professionals. I also take a limited number of one-on-one clients every month, so contact me when you're ready to work together through martinjohn.com. I also accept financial support through Venmo at martinjohn_Garcia. So if you benefit from listening to this content, please consider supporting my efforts. Thank you for listening to the Recover Yourself podcast, and until next time, keep recovering yourself.